Hello everyone, welcome to Ideas and Insights, a show devoted to exploring novel perspectives on contemporary issues. I am Badrinath Rao, your host. As cliched as it may sound, it is worth reminding ourselves we are living in an epoch marked by record levels of inequality. Since the 1980s, the top 1%'s net worth increased by $21 trillion. The bottom 50% lost $900 billion of its wealth. For the overwhelming majority, the American dream is a cruel illusion. Distrust is rampant. Our institutions are delegitimized. Our democracy is dysfunctional. We are now a plutocracy. Fascist forces loom menacingly on the horizon. How did we get here? My guest today is Professor Mehrsa Baradaran, a law professor at the University of California, Irvine, and an acclaimed authority on banking law. She is the author of The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America, published by W. Norton and Company this year. Neoliberalism seeks to revive classical liberal doctrines of individual liberty, property rights, free markets, and a stable social order. Yet, in reality, it hyper-glorifies market forces, and its main agenda, according to Professor Baradaran, is to weaken state power and augment the liberty of corporations. Neoliberalism, Professor Baradaran maintains, can be checked. She advocates human development and the reinstatement of democratic values of equity, equality of opportunity, fairness, and trust. Professor Baradaran joins me to discuss her ideas further. Welcome to Ideas and Insights, Professor Baradaran. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Indeed. Let's begin with the main theme of your book. Your work is an interesting analysis of the impact of neoliberalism on our economy and on virtually all facets of our life. What, according to you, is neoliberalism, and what does that have to do with what you call the looting of America?
Yes, so neoliberalism is very tricky to define because it sort of means everything and nothing depending on who you're speaking to. But Milton Friedman wrote an article sort of calling the ideology that they were putting forth, he and his group of economists that were the neoliberal sort of intellectual fathers. And the idea of it was that it was prioritizing the market over the state. The decisions of corporations and market actors over the democracies that would check them. That was the idea. And the idea would be that we would get more liberty, more shared prosperity by prioritizing the market. That's what it said it was. What it actually was a opening up of the democratic levers to money, the forces of money that have in the last 40 years since neoliberalism has been the political order, been corrupting and corroding the legal system. That's what I argue in the book.
Well, while talking about neoliberalism in the global context, you say that it's an ideology that succeeded the empire. It aims to create the hegemony, retain the hegemony of the Western nations, and is all about promoting an unjust world economic order. How does neoliberalism play out on the global scale, and what role do neoliberal thinkers from the West, particularly the United States, play in this process?
So, there have been books about neoliberalism before, and this is the gap that I found in the scholarship that I tried to fill in mine, is that, the original neoliberal founders, had the initial meeting in the Mont Pelerin Society in 1944. This is as the war is ending, the World War II. And these Austrian economists, these American economists are really trying to scramble on how do the Western nations sort of maintain their empires across the world. And most scholars really point to Reagan as the first neoliberal president, Reagan and Thatcher and these policies. But you're skipping from 1940 until 1980. That's a huge gap in terms of where was neoliberalism in the middle, and that's what I follow in the book, is what happens, in the very crucial decade of the 1960s as empires is ending based on the last ideology, which was essentially and very explicitly racial hierarchy. That is how the British dominated their colonies, and the French and the Spanish. And you have the Nazis taking that ideology and devastating Europe and committing mass Holocaust based on racial supremacy. And so that doctrine can no longer serve how it had justified the previous empires. And so there's this interregnum in between as to how do you justify, the oil corporations that were still in the Middle East, the copper corporations that were in Chile, and the resource extraction upon which the British Empire had been based, and the French Empire and the American Empire in less but significant ways at the time. And that ideology becomes neoliberalism. It's not just this ideology. There's also violence. There's also, dictators being put in and contra weapons being sent to South America and the Middle East. There's definitely armies also in, Vietnam and the threat of violence. But this is the dominant ideology that reigns after that tense interregnum that becomes the norm. It's really hard to even see past the world that neoliberalism builds. But it is empire nonetheless, under different terminologies. It's now just corporations. It's called the free market, but the debt goes one way, the resources go another way. The poverty stayed in the countries that were poor during colonization, and the wealth enriches the countries that were enriched during empire, with some small changes, but not too many.
While it is true that neoliberal forces tried to weaken nascent democracies, destabilize governments across the former colonies, you also talk about how there were concerted attempts from newly liberated states to push back. You mentioned the Nonaligned Movement, which met in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia. That, to me, is an interesting development. Unfortunately, it didn't take off. Why do you think that happened?
It didn't take off because it was cut off at the knees by the newly formed empires. And this is, both the Soviet Union and the United States at that point were empires that were ideologically anti-empire. This is the irony of what is happening in this time, is that the Soviet Union is calling the U.S. Capitalist empire, and the U.S. is calling the Soviets the evil empire. Both things are true. They were both empires in different ways, and they were also non-empires in ways that the British had been very explicitly empire. These are newly formed powers, and most of the newly freed nations in the global South essentially don't want to be caught in this game of empires. There is this war over these former colonies between the Soviets and the Americans, and so these nations join together in several places, in Paris and Bandung. OPEC becomes part of this to try to assert their sovereignty against this, this Cold War, these two nations. And so they form this non-aligned movement, the premise of which is we're not aligned with either of us. Just leave us alone, and we will not choose sides. We don't want to be part of this. And part of that also was give us one nation, one vote at the UN. And, in regional specific things, OPEC, for example, was against, there's seven sisters oil companies, or seven oil companies that were using the nations to go against each other. And so the nations of the Middle East joined forces, and this is, Iran, Egypt, every country that had oil, to to form a, they would call it a cartel, but form a group to negotiate against the Seven Sisters, which were actually a cartel. So some of those nations, some of those leaders are, taken down by coups, by the CIA and the British. Iran is an infamous example. That was the first of many of those violent interactions, and new people are placed. Some are taken down by violence. This is Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, lots of examples of just straight violence during that time. But those movements are cut off. Between the 1960s, you've got just tons of freedom fighters and all of these movements going across the world, and civil rights in America. To the mid 70s, it's relatively quiet. And that's not because people got what they were demanding. It's because, through violence, through ideological takeover, through these new ways of doing things, that got silenced.
You mentioned two institutions. One is the Federalist Society, and the second one is the Law and Society Network. And you say that both these institutions and the people who were leaders in these bodies were instrumental in entrenching neoliberal ideas in the judiciary, and that process had disastrous consequences. Can you take them one by one and tell us, for example, what the Federalist Society did, how it operates, and why you think it is deeply disconcerting?
Yes. You cannot justify the looting of other people's democracies without some of those forces coming back home. This was the sort of international karma of the thing, which is that there are these right-wing think tanks that are formed to do this thing abroad. These corporations that are losing their rights in these other countries, their sort of takings, form these right-wing groups to subtly maneuver and take over those corporations, those nations, and those forces also do this in America. So as America joining with the British and really sort of doing coups right around the world to take down these democratically elected, or at least sovereign nations, that those same forces start a coup inside of the American democracy as well. And I point to two of these organizations. One is Federalist Society, and it's Law and Economics, which are the two forces in America. They're, you trace the money, and it's the same foundations, the Koch brothers, the Coors, Heritage, American Enterprise Institute, all of these same right-wing think tanks are involved in the creation of these two legal institutions. And the Federalist Society basically starts at Yale Law School, spreads across law school, very top-down sort of student-based group, right? So the Federalist Society is one branch of this. Law and Economics is much more diffuse, but similar provenance, right? These are right-wing funded groups that have an ideological takeover in mind of the law, because they understand that the way that the civil rights movement had worked is through the courts, so they want to take those courts back. And that's the Federalist Society's essentially mission. The founding of the Federalist Society was very much an anti-Brown versus Board of Education, an anti-civil rights group. You don't see it very clearly, but if you trace it back to its origins, that's what was the impetus of it. It's harder to see now. So the Federalist Society basically, creates a network of judges and doctrines for these judges to sort of pledge allegiance to, right? Originalism and textualism that seem on their face to be neutral ways of reading the Constitution, but all have outcomes of rolling the clock back to before, civil rights, before these equality movements. Roe versus Wade becomes one of them, but it's very much interlocked in this larger system of right-wing groups. The Federalist Society has been incredibly successful in taking over the federal courts. Six out of 9 Supreme Court justices, all of the Republican appointees are Federalist Society judges, all of them. And you look at the appellate courts down into the district courts, and there's a way that the right has that it enforced this ideological purity, this litmus test for their judges, and that's the Federalist Society. Law and economics is harder to pinpoint, but I would argue much more profoundly influential on law as it relates to corporations and businesses and banks, which is the area I study. And law and economics is the idea that judges should be guided in their decisions not by sort of mushy, metrics like justice, but very, scientific ideas like cost-benefit analysis and economic principles. The meat of law and economics is anti-regulation. It's diminishing the power of the courts, diminishing the power of the regulators on banks, on corporations. And so these have been ongoing for the past 30, 40 years. And I trace in the book what has happened to the law. It's perforated with loopholes. You have, the industry itself writing their own laws through these movements that purported to be just legal ideologies and not right-wing attempts at a takeover of the law, but that is what they were.
Aside from the judiciary, you discuss at length in your book the havoc neoliberalism has played in the banking sector, an area that is your field of expertise. And you say that neoliberal policies have resulted in the creation of mammoth, risky, deregulated banks, and that is not good for the economy. How did this happen, and what are the consequences of neoliberalism in the banking sector?
To explain, it's not just banking; it's also monetary policy. And the first, you look at Enoch Powell, who was a just straight racist. In the he's a British prime minister, something cabinet member, and gives this speech in the 1960s called "The Rivers of Blood." All these immigrants are coming from the former colonies, and he's saying the streets will be filled with, the rivers will be full of blood, and very the British race is going to be diluted by intermixing with these people, really, really quite racist. He lost his job for it. That same year, as soon as he couldn't say those racist things, he goes and talks about monetary policy. Okay. Same with the Mont Pelerin Society. Their first aim is to take away the money power from the democracy and place it away from the people. Okay. So that to understand the significance of neoliberalism's attempt at taking over the banking policy, it's important to understand that link, because money is a policy decision. The creation of money itself, the way that money circulates, credit, all of that isn't out. We don't have money, it's not gold in a vault, which is what they would like you to believe. Money is a creation of a society. And so understanding that, which these economists did, and they saw what was happening across the world, which is that as soon as a nation gets sovereign, you can create your own money. America was, really being pushed to enhance social policy, to include, Black communities that had been left out since from the founding. And as soon as the net was about to include these racial others, they closed the net off. And that's what I sort of trace, and that's what comes out in banking now. So at first it's just close it off, make money scientific, really kind of constrain it, make it scarce so that it doesn't fund these things that the population doesn't want to fund, and by the way, use that race baiting to win seats. That's the whole Nixon agenda. And then what happens after that is, once now you have this sort of technocrats and these insulated regulators making these massive policy decisions, then you get into the Reagan era of the 80s and the 90s, where you're allowing these banks to essentially create money in newer and newer realms of finance, and until finance essentially takes over the entire economy. Finance used to be this tiny little thing, and now it's everything, and it's piling risks on top of risks, all of which are subsidized and guaranteed and insured by the federal government, and still are. So that's where banking, and this is my third book, and I've written many articles before that, following that story. And that story is a really devastating story if you're looking at racial equality or just equality in general. Banks leave, payday lenders come in. Banks stop lending or never start lending into these redline communities or not funding mortgages. And every inequality in America can be explained by these decisions that had to do with credit policy. My last book was called The Color of Money, and the color of money was white and enforced to be white. You could not lend, you couldn't have these, the federal funds going to Black communities. So those are incredibly important policy decisions that completely get taken over by neoliberalism. And I would say that was almost the impetus of neoliberalism from the beginning, is to close off the funds that were freely flowing before that.
While talking about the impact of neoliberalism generally and the ways in which it works, you characterize neoliberal strategies as devious and say that they focus on two types of issues, broadly speaking. One is discrediting democracy and making people get the impression that democracy is dysfunctional, it is rife with corruption, and therefore must be ignored. And the other thing they try to do is neoliberals want to gain control of the levers of policy-making bodies. How do these strategies play out in different sectors? Very briefly.
So the white economists who were the leading edges of this they're motivated by Brown versus Board of Education, really, all of them. You can really trace it back to this really radical shift in American policy. And the thing that they feel, and they say this, is victimized as taxpayers, as Americans, that all of a sudden they have to fund things that they don't want to, which is integrated schools and an extended democracy. So as soon as democracy threatens to become real, and including everybody, they discredit democracy. They feel like it was theirs to control, and now that it's just not valid. And so, James Buchanan writes, the calculus of consent, saying that essentially majorities are the tyrants of democracy because they're taking away from the minorities who are the tax-paying actual pillars of society. And so that's the core of the thing. It's just resentment that at democracy itself, at society, right? So Margaret Thatcher has this famous quote, "There's no such thing as society." And that's what neoliberalism is trying to do, and it's trying to enact. The irony is that the way it's doing it is by taking over the democracy, by, showing that actually democracy was working before they got in. So, you're discrediting, you're kind of projecting it doesn't work, and therefore we're going to come in and flood the field. So as Reagan is promising small government, fewer laws, he brings in the entire Heritage Foundation to take over the administrative state, to create more laws, more complex laws that favor the industries that they want. So it's not that they're diminishing the government. The government's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger every year that neoliberalism has been a reigning ideology. And more laws, more complexity, more lawyers.
You end the book, Professor Baradaran, by characterizing neoliberalism in an interesting way. You say it is a big, dumb, self-cannibalizing machine that has led to the financialization of society. It has created distrust and delegitimized institutions and so on. However, you end on a very optimistic note. You say that we can reinstate the democratic ethos, genuine democracy, which you say has not been practiced anywhere. Genuine free market policies have not been put in place anywhere, and that's what you plead for. And you say that if we emphasize human development, invest on the weakest neighborhoods, if we promote equality of opportunity, equity, fairness, justice, and so on, that we can vanquish neoliberalism. This is an encouraging thought. Can you elaborate on this briefly, please? We don't have too much time.
Yeah. Yes, the biggest sin of neoliberalism, I would say, is that they called the free market a thing that wasn't. Free market is what the non-aligned nations, this southern global south, was arguing for. Let it be free. Let us sell you oil rather than you take it. This was Mossadegh's offer to the West: is we will sell you the oil on a market. You can't just come and take it and threaten bombs and assassinations if we don't give you our resources. And neoliberalism yet pretends to be a free market. And so to have a free market, we have to have freedom and justice. And those things were the refusal that the neoliberalism tried to cover. To have a free market, you have to have a democracy. We have neither. Okay, so they tried to say, oh, it's either you're going to be tyrannized by government or tyrannized or have a free market, right? Failing to sort of close the loop, and that you can be tyrannized by corporations just as much as you can be tyrannized by the government. We actually have both now. We have corporations, billionaires, colluding with lawmakers to make laws that benefit both at the expense of all. So it's actually not working. And I did chase kind of the bad guys. I think the bad guys are gone. At this point, the market is a big dumb machine. That's what I call it at the end, in that it is taking our investments and investing them in the same private equity firms that are coming after our jobs, our healthcare, our education. And the thing that they're taking out is social trust and society, which is and has always been the underpinnings of a monetary system, of a market. You cannot have a market without trust. You cannot have an economy without a society. And so it's eroding all of those things. It's not that we have a good free market. It's not profitable. Okay, neoliberalism has yielded a few profits in the past for a few people, but it's invested in dying industries, oil, weapons. These are not industries that we need as a humanity to actually make profits and a future that is thriving for any of us. So and those things got lodged in the law through subsidies, and it's that is coming, it's imploding. We're seeing it all around us, and the distrust is at record levels. The danger is that these things don't implode just peacefully. The fascists come and they try to fix it. And this is also the lesson of history. When corruption is high and distrust is high, some group with guns say that we'll fix it by driving out some scapegoat, right? So whether it be the Jews in Nazi Germany or, the Islamic Republic of Iran taking out, any Westerners or any dissident thought, women usually are on the line when these things happen. So we're seeing it. And I think Americans are too naive if they think that fascism isn't at their door. It hasn't been yet. And I think we can, this is the hope. I do think we have the tools to overcome it, but those are the stakes.
We are completely out of time, Professor Baradaran. It was a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insight. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for your insightful questions and your thorough read. I really, really appreciate it. Great interview. Thank you.
That's it for today. Join us next week for a new episode of Ideas and Insights. We would love to hear from you about this episode. You can email us at ideasandinsights@wgte.org. Remember, you can access Ideas and Insights anytime by visiting our website, wgte.org/ideas and insights. Thanks for joining us today. We will see you next week. Until then, goodbye.